Today's video, I'm going to be buying a broken PS5 and trying to flip it for a profit. So naturally, I go on eBay, and this is the first listing that I see. It's a broken PS5 with a broken HDMI port up for auction. So I place a bid for $200, which is the most I'm willing to pay for a broken PS5 digital, since they only go for around $300 to $320. I really don't want to be paying anything more than $200 because I still want my profit margins to be at least $100, because I have to put some time and effort into figuring out what the actual issue is here. Now, in the description, it did say that they already tried replacing the HDMI port and the problem is still there, which leads me to two different conclusions. One, they either did a very bad job at putting on this HDMI port, which would be good because then it means that the fix is relatively easy. I just have to put an HDMI port back on there correctly, essentially. Option two, there's another issue in the PS5, which wouldn't be very good because that means I have to do diagnosing. On electronics, diagnosing is usually one of the hardest things to do. So I actually ended up winning the PS5 on the auction. I ended up paying $195 for it. Now all we have to do is wait a week. All right, guys, so it's actually been a week. And here is the PS5. We have it in the box. There is a little bit of damage to the box, so hopefully the broken PS5 isn't more broken, hopefully. But yeah, let's get this baby open. All right, so here's our PS5. Let's get it unboxed. Yeah, let's see. Regular ports are actually looking pretty good. Ports aren't looking too bad. Let's have a look at this HDMI port. Also isn't looking broken or anything, so we're definitely gonna have to break this bad boy open and see what's going on the inside. Alright guys, so first things first, before we can even think about fixing this HDMI port, we need to take this top panel off. As you can see, my friend is unscrewing all the screws for this top panel. It's not very complicated at all. You just have to remove all these screws and then the top panel just basically lifts off. Once we get that top panel off, the next step will be to take the fan out. Also, here's a quick tip if you get to this step. What you need to make sure that you're doing is applying some pressure to the female part of the plug where my friend just unplugged that fan from, to make sure that you don't break that plug. Okay, so now to remove this metal fan cover, all you need to do is unscrew 4 screws and it comes off just like that. Also, if you wanted to add more storage to your PS5, this is where you would add it. This is the fan blower. If you wanted to, you can clean it up real quick. You can see this one's just slightly dusty. And now we're moving on to removing the coaxial cables, which just pop right off. There's a few more screws we need to unscrew before we get to that HDMI port. So here's another tricky connector. What you want to do is make sure that you're adding some pressure right there where you see my friend is pressing down on that clip right there, and then you can pull out that ribbon cable. A lot of people make the mistake of just trying to yank it out with pure force and they end up breaking that connector. Okay, so now we just have a few more screws that we need to take off until we can get to that motherboard and actually start working on this HDMI port. Okay, so I actually forgot, but there's actually these 2 small brackets right here that we need to take off so that we can remove the motherboard. There's just 2 screws that are holding these 2 brackets in place, and then we have to unplug the motherboard from the power supply. Now we just need to pry up on this motherboard to unplug it from the power supply. You got the motherboard removed, and as you can see, there is liquid metal on the APU, which is way more conductive than thermal paste or thermal grease that you would use on a regular PC. Actually really interesting, and you don't want to get this stuff on your clothes because it will stain your clothes. But anyways, now my friend is cleaning up the HDMI port area and the contacts with a little bit of rubbing alcohol, preferably 90% or higher is recommended. We're using 99%, so we're just going to clean off that area really well so we can heat it up, start reflowing the HDMI port. So this is the HDMI port under the microscope, and what we're going to be doing is reflowing all those little tiny pins and pads that you see on there. So right now my friend is going to be adding a little bit of flux. That's what you see in that little syringe right there. He's just adding flux to those solder points so we can actually do a reflow on this board. So what exactly is a reflow? Well, in simple terms, it's a process where we heat up the solder joints on a component like the HDMI port or even the chips near it to essentially melt and re-solidify the solder. This helps reconnect any broken or weak connections that might be causing issues, since they already tried to replace the HDMI port and they're still having the same issue. Alright, you're probably wondering, why is my friend aiming a heat gun at those tiny solder joints? Over time, solder joints, those tiny connections that I showed you earlier, can crack or weaken, especially around components like the HDMI port, which are heavily abused. Those micro cracks are like tiny potholes in the electrical highway, causing interruptions in the signal. That's where the heat gun comes in. By carefully heating the solder, we're melting it just enough to let it flow back into place, filling in any cracks and reconnecting those critical pathways. Think of it like sealing up a crack in a bridge to make it strong again. Okay, so now that we have the HDMI port fully reflowed, now it's time to put the PS5 back together. In this clip, you can see my friend redistributing the liquid metal, which in this case is used as a thermal paste, and he's just making sure that it's distributed evenly across the APU. This is important because if you don't distribute it correctly, especially when reassembling the PS5, you can have overheating issues. Now that we're all done with the fixing process, let's put it back together and see if it actually works. When the truth has finally arrived after all the hard work and reflowing the HDMI port, reflowing the solder joints, and putting the console back together, it's time to see if our efforts paid off. Now the real test. Will we actually get a picture on the screen? Well, it looks like our fix didn't go as planned. The PS5 is indeed powering on, but we're still not getting any signal to the screen. It's disappointing, but hey, not every repair is super easy. This is the reality of repairing electronics. Sometimes the problem runs deeper than it seems. You only uncover it after you've already done the work. It's frustrating, but it's also part of the process. But hey, every failed fix teaches you something new, so there is a positive outcome to this. Since the HDMI port itself is fine, the issue could be with a retimer chip, a damaged trace, or even an APU itself. If you guys are interested in a part 2, like and subscribe. If this video gets 10 likes, I'll make a part 2.